For 130 years, one Canadian family controlled more of the nation's shopping life than any government, any bank, any church ever could. Newspapers didn't call them wealthy. They called them Canada's royal family. Their name was Eaton. Every autumn, a catalog arrived at the door like a second Christmas, thick as a phone book, promising anything a family could ever need. In the flagship stores, marble elevators rose past 9 floors of dry goods, furs, and toys, under a guarantee written in plain English: goods satisfactory or money refunded. Generations grew up trusting that promise completely. Then in a single week in August 1999, the doors closed for good. The jingle kept playing over empty aisles. The balloons kept floating over shelves nobody was shopping. How does an empire that lasted 4 generations, built entirely on trust, disappear almost overnight? This is the story of the family that taught Canada how to shop, and the collapse that no one saw coming until it was already too late. Timothy Eaton was born in 1834 in County Antrim, in what is now Northern Ireland, the youngest of 9 children in a farming family that had little to spare. He crossed the Atlantic as a young man, part of a wave of Irish immigrants seeking a country that hadn't decided yet who would rise and who wouldn't. He learned the dry goods trade the hard way, behind a counter in small Ontario towns, watching how merchants dealt with customers. What he saw troubled him. Prices changed depending on who was asking. Credit was extended to some and refused to others. Haggling rewarded the loud and punished the timid. Eaton believed there was a better way to sell things to people, and he intended to prove it. In December 1869, with his wife Margaret at his side, Timothy Eaton purchased a small dry goods shop on Yonge Street in Toronto. It was a modest space, barely 7 meters wide and 18 meters deep, with 2 shop windows facing a street that wasn't even considered fashionable yet. The real shopping district was blocks away on King Street. Eaton had 4 employees and a philosophy that most merchants of his era thought was reckless. One fixed price for every customer, no exceptions, no bargaining, and strictly cash, no credit extended to anyone, regardless of their standing in town. To Toronto's shopkeepers, it sounded like a man setting himself up to fail. Working-class families were used to negotiating. Wealthier customers were used to running a tab. Eaton was asking everyone to accept the same price, on the same terms, with money in hand. Some walked past his windows and shook their heads. Others walked in out of curiosity, expecting the usual haggling, and found none. They named a price, Eaton's clerks quoted the same price back, and that was the end of the conversation. There was no performance to it, no favoritism, no guessing whether you'd been overcharged for being a stranger in town. What Eaton was really selling, underneath the fabric and buttons and yard goods, was certainty. A mill worker's wife and a banker's wife paid exactly the same amount for exactly the same item on the exact same day. In a city where so much of daily commerce ran on who you knew and how well you could argue, that kind of plain dealing was almost unsettling in its simplicity. Eaton's core belief was direct, and he said versions of it for the rest of his life, that a merchant's only real asset was the customer's trust, and that trust, once earned honestly, was worth more than any single sale. He backed it eventually with a guarantee that became the most famous 4 words in Canadian retail: goods satisfactory or money refunded. In 1869, that was almost unheard of. A customer could return an item for any reason, no explanation required, and get their money back without an argument. The first year was lean. Expectations, even among his own family, were modest. But the store held on, then it grew, then it moved, first within Toronto, then across the country, carrying with it the same plain promise Timothy Eaton had opened with on that ordinary December day. One fair price for everyone every time. That promise was about to build something far larger than a dry goods shop on Yonge Street. It was about to become a national institution. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, Eaton's had stopped being simply a store. It had become a rhythm that Canadian families organized their year around. And for the family running it, these were remembered as the halcyon days, the years when Eaton's alone controlled roughly half of all department store sales in the entire country. The season that defined Eaton's more than any other was Christmas. It began every autumn with the arrival of the Christmas catalog. first published all the way back in 1897, so thick and so anticipated that children were allowed to circle their wish list items in pencil before it was even bedtime. But the catalog was only the opening act. On the fifth floor of the flagship Toronto store, Eaton's built Toyland, a fantasy department of trains circling under fake snow, walls of dolls, and, waiting at the center of it, Santa Claus himself, so that a child's letter to the North Pole and a child's actual visit to Santa could happen at the very same store. Then came the parade. On a Saturday morning each November starting in 1905, Eaton's shut down Toronto's ordinary business and replaced it with a mile and a half of floats, marching bands, and painted papier-mâché characters built by Eaton's own craftsmen in a warehouse that worked on next year's parade the moment this year's ended. By the 1950s, it was the largest Santa Claus parade in North America, watched in person by crowds Toronto newspapers estimated at 600,000 people, then broadcast into homes across the country by CBC starting in 1952. Eaton's ran nearly identical parades in Montreal and Winnipeg, meaning that on the same weekend, in 3 different cities, children across Canada were craning their necks for the same red suit, the same painted reindeer, the same signal that the countdown to Christmas had begun. One recurring figure, a small bear named Pumpkinhead, introduced in 1947, became so familiar to children that they cheered his float by name, the way they might cheer for a movie star. This was not simply advertising. For an entire generation, the Eaton's parade was Christmas beginning, full stop, the moment before which the season hadn't officially started, and after which it undeniably had. Away from the parade route, the flagship store itself carried its own kind of civic weight. The Yonge and Queen Street location in Toronto, where the parade traditionally ended, wasn't just a shopping destination. It was a landmark people used to give directions, a place where generations of the same family had their first job, their first winter coat, their first pair of skates. For working-class families, the layaway desk quietly did something the glamour of the parade never advertised. It let a mother put a coat or a bicycle on hold for a few dollars a week so that by December the gift under the tree had been paid for slowly, with dignity, rather than bought on credit that couldn't be afforded. Nobody wrote songs about the layaway counter, but for thousands of families it was the difference between a hopeful Christmas and a hollow one. Employees who worked the floor during these years often stayed for decades, not months, turning working at Eaton's into something closer to a vocation than a job, with staff parties, long service pins, and a shared pride in wearing the name. Regional newspapers of the era are full of small, specific testimonials. A Lethbridge woman who called an afternoon at the local Eaton soda counter the highlight of her week. A Toronto child who remembered being told, quite seriously, that the man on the 5th floor really was Santa Claus, because Eaton's had told her so, and Eaton's didn't lie. That trust, plain, unglamorous, built up one fair transaction and one Christmas parade at a time, was the real inheritance Timothy Eaton had left behind. His grandchildren were now presiding over a company that didn't just sell Canadians their winter coats and toys. It had, without anyone quite planning it that way, become one of the ways Canadians mark time itself. Birthday to birthday, Christmas to Christmas, generation to generation. But an empire built this deeply into the emotional life of a country carries a particular kind of risk. When something has become invisible because it feels permanent, no one is watching closely enough to notice the moment it stops being permanent at all. Success on Yonge Street was one thing. Turning that success into a national institution was another matter entirely. And it began with a single, deliberate gamble, taking Eaton's out of Toronto for the first time. In 1905, Eaton's opened its second major store nearly 2,000 kilometers away, on Portage Avenue in Winnipeg. It was a 5-story building occupying an entire city block, and the opening was treated less like a store launch than a royal visit. The Winnipeg Daily Tribune ran the news on its front page, calling Timothy Eaton the Canadian Napoleon of retail commerce. The initial staff of 750 grew to 1,200 within weeks. Within a few years, Winnipeggers were calling it simply the big store, and for a long stretch of the early 20th century, it was considered the most successful single department store on earth, relative to the size of the market it served. The lesson Eaton's took from Winnipeg was clear. The fixed-price, money-back promise that had worked on one street in Toronto could work anywhere in the country if the company was willing to build big enough to prove it meant business. The expansion that followed wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Timothy Eaton died in 1907, and leadership passed to his son, John Craig Eaton, who kept the growth going until his own death from influenza in 1922. The company then passed to Timothy's nephew, R.Y. Eaton, who oversaw the most aggressive period of physical expansion in the company's history. Through the 1920s, new Eaton stores opened in Red Deer, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Edmonton, and Calgary in Alberta, in Saskatoon, and Prince Albert in Saskatchewan, in Hamilton and Port Arthur in Ontario, and in Halifax on the East Coast. The company also bought its way into new territory outright, acquiring a small Ontario chain called Canadian Department Stores to gain footholds in towns like Chatham, Belleville, and Huntsville, and purchasing the Montreal retailer Goodwin's, which by 1927 had grown into a 6-story Eaton's store on St. Catherine Street, expanded to 9 stories within 3 years. None of this physical growth would have meant much on its own without the second engine driving Eaton's expansion, the catalog. First issued in 1884 to reach visitors passing through the Toronto Industrial Exhibition, the catalog very quickly became something bigger than an advertisement. It became the way Eaton's reached the parts of Canada that no store, however large, could physically cover. As the national railway system grew, Eaton's negotiated steadily lower freight rates, eventually offering free shipping on any catalog order over $25. For a homestead family on the prairies or a fishing town on the Atlantic coast, that meant the same fixed prices and the same money-back guarantee available on Yonge Street could now arrive by rail without ever setting foot in a city. By 1903, order volume had grown so large that Eaton's opened a dedicated mail-order building in Toronto just to keep up. This expansion changed what it meant to work for Eaton's. In the early years, employment had meant a handful of clerks behind a single counter. By the 1920s, it meant tens of thousands of jobs across the country. Sales floors, mail-order processing rooms, warehouses, delivery routes, spread from Halifax to Calgary. For many towns, an Eaton's store arriving wasn't just a shopping option. It was often one of the largest employers in the region, offering steady, respectable work in communities that hadn't had access to that kind of institution before. For the company, though, that same speed of growth was already quietly reshaping what Eaton's actually was. It had started as one man's answer to unfair pricing on one street in Toronto. It was becoming something closer to a national infrastructure, as embedded in daily Canadian life as the railways that were now delivering its parcels door to door. By the time the expansion machine finally slowed, Eaton's wasn't just a department store chain anymore. It was on the verge of becoming something no Canadian company, before or since, has quite managed to be again. Not just successful, but genuinely, unmistakably a part of the national identity. By 1930, the numbers told a story almost too large to be believed. Eaton's alone controlled 60% of every dollar spent in department stores across the entire country. No single retailer in Canada, before or since, has ever held a share of a national market that dominant. But numbers like that only explain the business. They don't explain what Eaton's had actually become in the daily imagination of the country. Because by this point, Eaton's wasn't competing with other stores so much as it was competing with holidays, weather, and the calendar itself for a place in people's memories. The clearest evidence of that saturation wasn't a sales report. It was a parade. By 1952, the Eaton's Santa Claus Parade was being broadcast across Canada by CBC television, and its reach didn't stop at the border. The footage was packaged and sold to the American network CBS, reaching an estimated 25 million viewers in the United States, alongside the millions more watching at home. A Canadian department store's Christmas promotion, filmed on the streets of Toronto, was being watched in living rooms from Vancouver to Virginia. When color broadcasts began in 1970, the spectacle only grew. Floats built by Eaton's own craftsmen, in a warehouse that worked on the parade nearly year-round, filmed in full color for a continent's worth of children who had never set foot in the store the parade was built to promote. This was not incidental advertising. It was, by any honest measure, one of the largest and longest-running pieces of cultural programming in North American history. and Eaton's had been running it since 1905, 19 years before Macy's launched its own version in New York. The reach of the brand was matched by the standing of the family behind it. The Eatons had, by this era, become something Canada had never quite had before or since. A genuine retail dynasty, openly described by journalists and later by broadcasters as the country's royal family. Their fortune at its height estimated near $2 billion. It wasn't a title the family invented for itself. It was one the country handed them, because there was no other way to describe a family whose name appeared on the front of stores in every province, whose parade closed out Toronto's civic calendar every November, and whose statue, a bronze likeness of Timothy Eaton, funded not by the company, but by its own employees for the firm's 50th anniversary in 1919, sat at the entrance of the flagship store like the founder of a nation might sit at the entrance of a Capitol building. What made this saturation different from ordinary brand loyalty was how it moved through families rather than through individuals. A grandmother who had stood in the crowd for the very first parade in 1905 could, by the 1950s, be standing on the same downtown sidewalk with her own grandchildren, watching the same company's floats roll past. The fixed price promise Timothy Eaton had made to strangers on Yonge Street in 1869, now stretching across 4 living generations of the same family. Children who visited Toyland on the 5th floor grew into parents who brought their own children to the very same toy department, then grandparents who did it a third time. The Christmas catalog that had once been a novelty for reaching rural customers by rail had become an artifact passed hand to hand every autumn. Something a family didn't just receive, but anticipated, the way they anticipated the first snow. For employees, working for Eaton's at this height carried its own quiet prestige. Long service pins, staff parties, decades-long careers on a single sales floor. These weren't perks handed down from a distant head office. They were evidence that being part of Eaton's meant something in a community, the same way being part of a respected local church or civic organization meant something. In small towns across the prairies and the Maritimes, an Eaton's uniform wasn't just a job, it was a form of belonging. This is the moment the story asked to be paused, not rushed past. Everything that followed, the debt, the boardroom decisions, the slow retreat from 60% market share down toward 11, happened to a company that, at this exact point in its history, was not merely large. It was beloved in a way few Canadian institutions of any kind have ever managed to be. Before the story turns toward decline, it's worth sitting, just for a moment, inside a Toronto sidewalk in November, a child's hand held tightly, watching Santa's float come around the corner, believing, the way an entire country had been carefully taught to believe, that this particular kind of magic would simply always be there. It would not. In 1976, without a parade, without a press conference, without much fanfare at all, Eaton's quietly closed its catalog division. For most shoppers, it barely registered as news. The stores were still full. The Santa Claus parade still filled the streets every November. Nobody standing in a Toronto crowd that year, watching the floats roll past, would have guessed that the company behind them had just shut down the very tool that built its national reach in the first place. The mail-order network that once carried Eaton's fixed prices to families who had never set foot in a city. To the average customer, it looked like a minor business decision. In hindsight, it was the first thread pulled from a fabric that had taken a century to weave. The truth was that the catalog's usefulness had been eroding for years, quietly overtaken by suburban shopping centers, discount retailers, and a Canada that no longer needed a mail-order lifeline to reach modern goods. But the deeper problem wasn't the catalog, it was the stores themselves. The great downtown flagships, the marble floors, the 9-story towers, the departments built for an era when a shopping trip was a full-day event, had become extraordinarily expensive to run in a country that was rapidly moving its shopping habits to suburban malls with free parking and lower overhead. Eaton's had the buildings. It didn't yet have the answer for how to make buildings that size profitable in a changing retail landscape. There were also self-inflicted wounds. At some point in this stretch, Eaton's made the decision to cancel its long-running Trans-Canada sale, a promotional tradition customers had come to count on, the way they counted on the parade. The backlash was immediate and lasting. It was a small decision that did outsized damage, souring goodwill among exactly the kind of loyal, repeat customers who had built the company's reputation for fair dealing in the first place. None of it was catastrophic on its own, but each decision chipped, quietly, at a foundation that had been assumed by customers, by employees, even by the Eaton family itself, to be permanent. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the pressure had a new name: Walmart. When the American discount giant expanded into Canada, it didn't just bring lower prices, it brought a retail model built from the ground up for cost efficiency, without the weight of century-old flagship buildings, without a payroll shaped by decades of long-service employees, without a Santa Claus parade to fund every November. Eaton's and the department store model it had helped invent simply hadn't been built to compete on that basis. The numbers made the slide brutally clear. The company that controlled 60% of Canadian department store sales in 1930 had fallen to roughly 11% by 1997. That is not a company in trouble. That is a company that has already lost the argument and simply hasn't said so publicly yet. And this is where the story turns into something closer to tragedy than simple business history. Because almost nobody shopping at Eaton's in the 1970s and 1980s felt any of this happening. A woman who had shopped there for 50 years, quoted years later, reflecting on exactly this era, remembered trusting Eaton's completely. If something she bought there ever went wrong, she knew the store would make it right. That trust wasn't naive. It was earned, honestly, over more than a century. But trust is not the same thing as awareness. And while customers were still walking familiar aisles under a familiar name, executives inside the company were beginning to see numbers that told a very different story. One the public wouldn't be shown for another decade. Publicly, Eaton's leadership did what most beloved institutions do when the ground starts shifting beneath them. It reassured. Store renovations continued. The parade continued. The name on the building didn't change, and neither did the tone of the company's public messaging. Whether that confidence was genuine belief that the company could still turn things around, or simply an unwillingness to be the generation of Eatons that admitted the family's institution was in real danger, is a question the historical record doesn't answer cleanly. What is clear is this: somewhere in these 2 decades, a company built entirely on the promise of trust and permanence quietly stopped being either, and almost no one outside its boardrooms noticed in time. How long can a company this deeply loved actually coast on the goodwill of the past before the past stops being enough? The answer was already being written in boardrooms the public hadn't been let into yet, and what happened there would prove far more damaging than a canceled sale or a discontinued catalog ever could. For most of its history, Eaton's had one signature that no other major Canadian retailer could claim. It had never truly answered to anyone outside the family. 4 generations of Eaton's had run the company as founder, as heir, as steward. And for most of that time, it worked. But by the 1990s, that same structure, once a strength, had become one of the most consequential liabilities in the company's history. While competitors adapted to a rapidly changing retail landscape with outside expertise and fresh capital, Eaton's leadership remained, for decades, an internal conversation among family members loyal to a name rather than a rotating board answering to shareholders. The decision to keep control this tightly for this long wasn't reckless in any single year, but compounded across 2 or 3 decades of shrinking market share. It meant that by the time real structural change finally came, it came far too late to matter. That change arrived in 1997, and it arrived out of necessity, not vision. With debts to banks and suppliers exceeding $300 million, the company could no longer meet its obligations, and George Eaton, a great-great-grandson of the founder, was forced to file for bankruptcy protection under Canada's Companies Creditors Arrangement Act. 21 stores closed, roughly 2,000 employees, many of them the long-service, decades-on-the-floor kind of staff the company had always been proud of, lost their jobs. The restructuring plan that followed secured a credit line of $250 million, backed, tellingly, by nearly everything the company still owned. George Eaton resigned as chief executive that same year, And for the first time in the company's 128-year history, a non-family outsider, George Kosich, was brought in to run it. The following year brought a decision that would have been unthinkable to Timothy Eaton's generation. The company went public. In 1998, under new chairman Brent Ballantyne, Eaton's issued 11.7 million shares at $15 each, raising fresh capital from outside investors for the first time in its history. The Eaton family retained just over half the company, a 51% stake, enough to keep control on paper, but a clear signal that the private, closed-door era of family ownership was ending. To some, this looked like overdue modernization. To others, it looked like a family finally admitting, in the most public way possible, that it could no longer fund its own survival alone. What professional management and public capital couldn't fix was the market's underlying judgment of what Eaton's was actually worth. By the spring of 1999, with the family openly shopping the company for sale, financial analysts on Bay Street had already reached a blunt conclusion. They weren't valuing Eaton's as a beloved national institution. They were valuing it as a real estate portfolio, assessing what its store leases and physical properties might fetch, on the assumption that the Eaton's name itself carried little remaining commercial value. For a company whose entire foundation had been built on the idea that its name was a promise worth trusting, that judgment was as close to a public verdict as a business can receive before its funeral. Employees on the sales floor lived this reality without needing a stock ticker to tell them. Workers who had spent 20, 30 years building a career inside Eaton's watched senior leadership rotate through boardroom strategies, restructuring, public offering, sale negotiations, while their own job security depended on decisions being made entirely without them. For franchise-adjacent staff and long-serving department heads alike, the pension and benefits they had been promised across decades of loyal service were now tied to the financial health of a company that outside experts openly doubted could survive on its own name alone. The clearest sign that insiders already knew the end was near came in the summer of 1990. After months of quiet negotiations, talks with the only seriously interested buyer, widely believed to be the American retailer Federated Department Stores, the parent company of Macy's, potentially alongside Sears Canada as a partner, collapsed without a deal. Within days, Eaton shut down its major Toronto distribution warehouse, laid off 300 workers, and began turning away truckloads of merchandise arriving for the Christmas season. To retail insiders, closing a warehouse in August during the exact window when a department store should be stockpiling for its most important season of the year wasn't just a cost-cutting measure. It was a company quietly raising the white flag months before it would say so publicly. Even some of the company's most sentimental admirers had begun preparing for the end before it officially arrived. When asked about Eaton's uncertain future that year, Winnipeg's own mayor, a city whose downtown had once been defined by the big store on Portage Avenue, expressed the kind of resigned affection reserved for something already understood to be dying, pride in what it had been, paired with an acceptance that its time may have simply passed. And who in the end was responsible for protecting the people who had built this company with their own hands? The clerks, the department heads, the delivery drivers, the generations of Etonians who had given Eaton's their working lives on the understanding that loyalty would be returned in kind? The record suggests no single villain. It suggests something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. A family that loved its own legacy sincerely but couldn't bring itself to change course early enough to save it. And a company that kept its public face calm and reassuring right up until the moment it no longer could. That moment was only weeks away. The end, when it finally came, arrived not gradually but all at once, in a single week that Canadian newspapers would later describe as the most tumultuous in the company's 130-year history. The public first sensed something was seriously wrong at the start of that week in August 1999, when Eaton's executives admitted publicly that months of searching for a buyer had failed completely. The one serious suitor, the American retailer Federated Department Stores, parent of Macy's, with Sears Canada floated as a possible partner, had walked away from the table. Within days, Eaton shut its major Toronto distribution warehouse, laid off 300 workers on the spot, and began turning away truckloads of merchandise meant for the Christmas selling season still months away. Restructuring experts reading the situation from the outside didn't mince words. Shutting a warehouse in August during the exact window a department store should be stockpiling inventory wasn't a cost-saving measure. It was surrender, dressed up as logistics. By the end of that same week, the company took the step it had been circling for months. Eaton's closed all 9 of its stores across Quebec in a single day, sending 2,000 employees home with no clear answer about whether they would ever be called back. Trading in the company's shares was halted. That night, Eaton's confirmed what almost every retail analyst, supplier, floor clerk, and loyal customer in the country had quietly come to expect. The company was filing for bankruptcy protection, its second trip through the courts in 2 years. All 64 remaining stores across the country would stay open through the weekend, but management announced they would immediately begin liquidating merchandise. For a staff of roughly 13,000 people, there was no reassurance offered about their jobs, only a plan for how quickly the shelves would be emptied. What made the scene almost unbearable to witness wasn't the paperwork or the press releases. It was the ordinary theater of retail continuing to play out inside stores that everyone now understood were dying. Clerks still handed out coupons offering up to 40% off. Orange, pink, and purple balloons, leftover decorations from a recently renovated cosmetics floor, drifted along the ceiling as though nothing had changed. The company's own jingle, Eaton's, "We want to be your store," kept playing over the sound system, cheerful and oblivious, while the aisles beneath it stood almost empty. One woman, a customer for 50 years, put into words what so many others were quietly feeling that week. She had shopped there her entire life, she said, because she trusted that if anything ever went wrong with what she bought, Eaton's would make it right. That promise, the same one Timothy Eaton had built the company on in 1869, was now being spoken about in the past tense, by a woman standing in a store that was still, technically, open. The Eaton family did not disappear behind lawyers and spokespeople in these final days, and to their credit, that mattered to the people who had spent their working lives under the family name. The 4 brothers who represented the last generation to run the company, Fred, John Craig, Thor, and George Eaton, traveled personally to Edmonton and to Vancouver that week, walking the sales floors, shaking hands with staff, trying to offer some form of reassurance in person rather than through a press release. It was, in its own way, a final act of the old Eaton's instinct, that trust was something you protected face-to-face, not from a boardroom. One former Eaton's executive, interviewed at the time, still held out a sliver of hope that some last-minute buyer might emerge, a white knight in his words, to save what remained. No one did. For the 13,000 employees whose futures now hung on a bankruptcy court's timeline, the experience varied store to store, but the emotional shape of it was the same everywhere. Some had worked the floor for 30 years, accumulating pension credits and long service pins under the understanding that loyalty to Eaton's would be honored the way Eaton's had always claimed to honor its customers. Now they faced the same uncertainty as a new hire, with the added, harder knowledge of exactly how much they stood to lose. Department heads who had trained under managers, going back generations, were suddenly filling out unemployment paperwork in the same building where they'd spent their entire adult working lives. Media coverage across the country treated the collapse less like an ordinary business bankruptcy and less like sports reporting on a loss, and more like a death in the family. Because for many Canadians, that's genuinely what it felt like. Commentators noted that Eaton's had helped define modern Canadian retail itself, and its fall wasn't just the disappearance of a place to buy winter coats. It was the disappearance of a name that had, for 4 generations, been treated as a fixed point in Canadian life, as reliable in its own quiet way as the seasons or the mail. In the months that followed, the 64 remaining stores wound down one by one through liquidation, their windows plastered with clearance signage where holiday window displays had once drawn children by the thousands. Sears Canada, Eaton's longtime rival, ultimately acquired the company's shares and much of its physical footprint, including its prime lease inside the Toronto Eaton Centre, the very mall built on the site of Eaton's original downtown flagship and named in its honor. For a brief period, Sears Canada tried operating a small upscale chain under a modified version of the old name, a final attempt to keep something of Eaton's alive in the market. It didn't last. By February 2002, the Eaton's name was retired from Canadian retail entirely. 133 years after Timothy Eaton had opened a small dry goods shop on Yonge Street with 4 employees and a promise that a fair price should be the same for everyone. The building at Yonge and Queen, where it had all effectively centered for a century, didn't disappear. It became part of the mall that still carries the Eaton name today, walked past by hundreds of thousands of shoppers a year who may have no idea whose promise and whose century of trust the name above the door was ever meant to honor. The company was gone. What it had built into the country's imagination. A parade that still runs every November. A name still printed on a shopping center's signage. A memory still carried by everyone old enough to have believed the man on the 5th floor really was Santa Claus. Proved far harder to erase than the business itself ever had been. In the years right after the bankruptcy, the most visible answer to the question of what replaced Eaton's was, uncomfortably, the company that had circled the deal from the start. Sears Canada absorbed Eaton's shares and inherited much of its physical footprint, including the prime real estate inside Toronto's Eaton Centre, a mall that had been built on the site of Eaton's own flagship store and still carried its name. For a short time, Sears Canada tried something almost sentimental, relaunching a scaled-down chain called simply Eaton's, an attempt to keep some version of the name alive in the market rather than let it disappear entirely. It survived barely 3 years. By February 2002, even that final echo was gone, rebranded to Sears outright, and the name that had once meant 60% of Canadian department store sales stopped appearing on a single storefront in the country. The deeper lesson of Eaton's collapse became almost painfully clear with the passage of time, because the story didn't end with Sears Canada's victory. Sears Canada, the company that had absorbed Eaton stores, its leases, and much of its remaining customer goodwill, filed for its own bankruptcy in October 2017, just 18 years after taking Eaton's place. By 2018, every Sears Canada store was closed as well. The retailer that had seemed to win the department store war in 1999 had, within 2 decades, lost that same war itself. Undone by the identical forces that had brought down Eaton's, online shopping, discount competitors, and department store buildings that had become too large and too expensive to justify their own square footage. In hindsight, Eaton's collapse wasn't an isolated failure of one overconfident family business. It was the first domino in the slower, quieter collapse of an entire retail model that Canada and much of North America had once assumed was simply permanent. For the communities that had depended on Eaton's as an economic anchor, the impact went well beyond a single storefront closing. In towns across the prairies and the Maritimes, where an Eaton's location had often been among the largest employers for miles, the loss of those jobs rippled outward into the smaller businesses that depended on Eaton's foot traffic to survive. Downtown cores that had been built, quite literally, around the assumption that shoppers would arrive by streetcar or on foot to visit the flagship store, found themselves with a permanent gap at their center, one that, in many cities, has still never been fully filled by anything else. For the thousands of employees who had spent decades on Eaton sales floors, the aftermath meant piecing together new careers in an economy that no longer offered the kind of long-service, single-employer stability the company had once represented. Some transitioned into retail roles at the very competitors, Sears and later big box chains, that had helped drive Eaton's under in the first place. Others, particularly those closest to retirement, found that pension arrangements built around decades of loyal service didn't translate cleanly into a bankruptcy court's list of creditors, leaving some with far less security than a lifetime of work should reasonably have earned them. What survived in the end wasn't the company. It was the name, stripped of its business and repurposed as pure nostalgia. Printed on a shopping center sign in Toronto that hundreds of thousands of people pass beneath every year, most of them with no idea that the name once represented a family, a promise, and 60% of a nation's shopping habits. The statue of Timothy Eaton, once positioned at the entrance of his own flagship store, like a monument to a living institution, was quietly relocated to the Royal Ontario Museum after the bankruptcy, no longer presiding over commerce, but preserved instead as history. What does a country actually lose when an institution like this disappears and nothing quite manages to take its place? Perhaps it's simply this: a certain kind of trust that used to be built slowly, over generations, between a family business and the customers who believed in it. The kind of trust that doesn't transfer easily to a website and that no amount of discount pricing has ever fully replaced. Picture, one last time, a Saturday morning in November, decades ago now. The air is cold enough to see your breath. Somewhere down the street, a marching band is warming up, brass catching the gray light, and children are being lifted onto their father's shoulders for a better view. Then the first float turns the corner, and for a moment the whole street seems to exhale at once. A little further along, past the crowd, past the window, displays glowing with mechanical snow. There is a store, tall, marble-floored, familiar in a way that needs no explanation, and somewhere on one of its upper floors, a child is climbing a small set of stairs toward a man in a red suit. Absolutely certain, the way only a child can be certain, that this is the real one. Nobody in that crowd is thinking about balance sheets or market share. They are only thinking that the season has begun and that it will always begin exactly this way. That certainty was never really about a parade or a coat bought on layaway or a name printed above a door. It was about what a family business, at its best, can quietly offer a country that no government program or advertising budget can manufacture on its own. A shared point of reference. A place where a grandmother's memory and a grandchild's memory could, for one Saturday morning a year, be standing in exactly the same spot. Eaton's mattered not because it sold coats and toys more cheaply than anyone else, but because it made an entire nation feel, for over a century, that fairness was something a business could actually promise and keep. That the price you were quoted was the price everyone was quoted. That a mistake would be made right without an argument. That trust, once given honestly, would be honored in return. That belief shaped how generations of Canadians understood what commerce was supposed to feel like, long before most of them ever thought to question it. It also gave working families something rarer than convenience: dignity, a layaway payment made quietly, a few dollars at a time, so that a Christmas gift could arrive without debt attached. A steady job on a sales floor that could support a family for 30 years with a pension and a long service pin waiting at the end of it. A downtown flagship that wasn't just a place to shop, but a landmark a town organized its geography and its sense of itself around. None of that shows up cleanly in a bankruptcy filing. All of it disappeared anyway, and nothing that came after. Not the discount chains, not the shopping centers, not the endless convenience of buying anything from anywhere without ever leaving home, has quite managed to replace what that dignity felt like. So this is not a story told to assign blame or to mourn a business the way one might mourn a failed investment. It is told because something real happened inside those stores for 4 generations, to millions of ordinary people who never appear in any company history. The woman at the soda counter in Lethbridge, the department head who trained under a manager who had trained under a manager going back to the company's earliest years, the child certain that the man on the 5th floor really was Santa Claus because a name she trusted had told her so. Timothy Eaton built something on the modest premise that people deserved to be treated fairly and told the truth about what they were buying. For 130 years, in ways both enormous and quiet, that premise held. It is worth remembering not because the company still exists, it doesn't, but because the standard it set once did, and because a country is a little poorer in ways that are hard to measure whenever a promise like that is finally allowed to end. Somewhere tonight, someone in Toronto will walk beneath a sign that still reads Eaton Center, without a second thought for the family whose name it carries, or the century of trust that name once represented. That in the end may be the most honest kind of memorial there is, not a monument built to be noticed, but a name quietly outliving the business it once belonged to, still standing long after everyone who built it has gone home.